I'm Kate Seeley, Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute, and I want to welcome you to today's panel, the Yemen Quagmire. We're very pleased to co-sponsor this discussion with the Conflict Management Program here at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So many thanks to Isabel Talping Long and Dan Surwer for facilitating today's talk. We're here to discuss the tragic war in Yemen and a potential way forward out of the morass. UN-mediated talks in Geneva collapsed in December with no outcome, and a new round of talks have yet to be scheduled. In the meantime, fighting continues between the forces of President Abd Rabbu Mansur Hadi, backed by a Saudi-led coalition against Houthi rebels in alliance with former Yemeni President Abdullah Ali Saleh. Rivalry between Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS threatens to expand the violence to Yemen's eastern region. The UN Security Council declared that Yemen is suffering a dire humanitarian situation, which continues to worsen. While war and refugee flows elsewhere in the Middle East command the news spotlight, Yemen has commanded far less attention. And we hope to address that somewhat in our very modest way with today's event. We're very fortunate to be able to present a panel with remarkable expertise on Yemen's political and social situation. It was to be moderated by SAIS and MEI scholar Dan Surwer, who specializes in conflict mediation and would have brought a lot of insights to the table. But sadly, he called in sick this morning, and so I am very hastily filling his very big shoes. So we wish Dan a very speedy recovery. Our speakers today, in order of appearance. Oopsie. Whenever you do this, you miss something. Here we go. Charles Schmitz. He's an MEI scholar, professor of geography at Towson University, and a longtime leader among his colleagues at the American Institute for Yemeni Studies. Charles's very insightful writings on Yemen can be found on MEI's website, mei.edu. Amat Alsoswa is a leader and activist who took part in Yemen's national dialogue from 2012 to 2014. Earlier, she served as UN Assistant Secretary General, as Assistant Administrator of the UN Development Program, and as Director of UNDP's Regional Bureau for the Arab States. From 2003 to 2005, she was Yemen's first Minister of Human Rights. Andrew Plitt is the director of the Office of Iraq and Arabian Peninsula Affairs at USAID. He's a career member of the Senior Foreign Service with nearly 25 years of experience with USAID, including field assignments across the Middle East and in sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, last but not least, Leslie Campbell. He is Senior Associate and Regional Director of Middle East and North Africa programs at the National Democratic Institute. He spent 20 years at the head of NDI's regional programs with experience advancing political, civic, and governance reform throughout the Arab world and has published extensively on the issues. So a welcome to all of our very, very fine panelists. We look forward to an in-depth conversation today, ranging across many topics. I want to start with Charles Schmitz, who has written extensively on the many parties to this conflict. Charles, all conflicts are complex, but Yemen seems especially complex because of the many players and alliances. Could you just map out this landscape of alliances and parties to the conflict for our audience, beginning with the major antagonists, on the one hand, President Hadi, on the other hand, the Houthis, and talk a little bit about how the war is unfolding.
Okay, in 5 minutes? Six. Okay. So Hadi's, the Saudi-led Hadi coalition is quite ragtag. It's I would describe it as a group of very disorganized and contradictory forces. That the only thing that possibly unites them is their opposition to Houthi and Saleh in the north. The main factions that Hadi tries to patch together are Southerners, the Southern Resistance, which is a diverse group of people with very different political outlooks, and many of whom were opposed to Hadi and opposed his coming to Aden in the first place. And I think to some extent, I'm not sure, but the war and the formation of a southern resistance may have united them somewhat, but we're seeing lots of infighting between them in Aden right now. So I'm not sure how the degree to that. The Salafis, of course, were one of the targets of the Houthis, and they have withdrawn and headed to the south, so they play some role. And Hadi appointed Hamakani, a Salafi leader, to his administration. And then you have another main force, which is kind of remnants of the Yemeni military. There really doesn't exist the Yemeni military anymore. The most coherent, I think, factions of it lie with Saleh in the north. But some remnants of it ended up in the Hadramaut and in the eastern desert region. Those have been kind of gathered together by the Saudis under the leadership of al-Maqdishi, who's an associate of Ali Muqsin al-Ahmar. And so it's kind of a Islahi-led group, but not exclusively, of course. Those, of course, they have made many statements against the Southerners and against Southern aspirations. So there's been quite a bit of animosity between that Jauf, Marib region up there, the coalition forces there, and the forces in the south. So it's really quite disorganized. The regions that Hadi controls, Hadi doesn't control anything. Al-Qaeda has inserted itself, but in a way unlike it did in 2011 when it actually tried to govern and control territory. Now it seems to be trying to play a role more in the background. It sets up a checkpoint, but doesn't really intervene too much. It is benefiting tremendously from smuggling, it appears. The northern forces, or I call them northern forces, and I would say one thing I do see is an increased, people talk about increased sectarianism. I have felt that to some degree, but one thing I've really felt is increased north-south animosity. I've seen a lot more of that, and it's another sad development. It's mostly sad developments here. So in the north, Saleh and the Houthi. Saleh commands quite a bit of the military forces. The best military forces are with him. The most coherent, I would say, those that are trained as a military, those that understand military operations, they are with him. The Houthi don't command. They have some, but they mostly command militias and whatnot. Those forces are being degraded. The air campaign against them, they have no defenses against the air campaign, and the air campaign has been continuous now since what? April? March, yes, okay, so it's been a long time. It's difficult to operate when you have no air cover. So those forces are being degraded, though not to the degree that many people had thought. The Saudis and the coalition created a blockade of the ports and tried to keep supplies coming in, but hey, this is Yemen, and everybody's out to make some profit. So smuggling has enabled the Houthi and Saleh to gain oil supplies. I think, ironically, some of it's coming through Al-Qaeda territory. So we have Al-Qaeda selling oil to the Houthi. And there's just was a report that Wadiya, which is the main entrance into the Jauf region, Hadi's commanders were making money by selling it to the black market, which of course went to the Houthis and Saleh. So their capabilities are not as degraded as one would have expected from the air campaign and the blockade. However, they are clearly on the defensive, and they're losing slowly territory. The question is, how long is it going to take? I mean, if it kept up, the situation keeps up as it is, which appears to be what the combatants seem to want to do at this point. It would be a long, slow grind in which everybody suffers, and we enter in a phase of total destruction.
So what does the battlefield look like? Where is most of the fighting taking place?
The Houthi, one strategic, very important place is SAIS, where Houthi Saleh have imposed a blockade, and they seem to have a solid grip on the city. It's politically very important, the city. It's strategic. It's in the southern highlands. And the coalition has put tremendous resources into trying to liberate, and they've made very, very little progress there. Then the forces are coming out of the eastern desert towards Sana'a. There's an area where just recently there's been some advances where they've started to move towards the outskirts of Sana'a. But what we have to remember there is what they've done is they've come in through the desert area, and they've just kind of begun to get into the mountainous regions. And it's in the mountainous regions where the kind of the Houthi-style militia fighting, where they, for 6 wars, held off Saleh. And Saleh knows this area quite well as well. These mountainous regions, they haven't really started a battle there yet. And I suspect when they get into that area, it's going to be much tougher going now for these coalition forces. So, no clear victory expected on either side, just destruction. I should add that, from looking at this overall, you see no you see no growing force that could take Yemen in any direction. You just see destruction. You just see destruction of the government institutions, destruction of the military, destruction of any. There is no political force on either side that seems to be sort of creating a coherent vision and capability of sort of settling the war in any direction at all. It just seems to be everybody going for total destruction on all sides. It's quite sad.
Very depressing. What is the impact that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS, what impact are they having on the conflict right now?
On the conflict, they fight a bit in the south. What they seem to be doing is sort of consolidating their capabilities. They've controlled Mukalla, which is a key port in the eastern seaboard. They seem to be deeply involved in the oil smuggling that's going on there. They have appeared in Houta, they appeared in Abyan, but they seem to appear and then disappear. They have played, at the beginning of the war, they played a major role in trying to position themselves as the leadership of the resistance to the Houthi coming down, because of course they are one of the main targets of the Houthi. I'm not sure how much of a fighting force. I know that there's uneasiness in Taiz about their presence there, and so they are present there. But they seem to be mostly concentrated in the south, and they've taken heavy losses in the leadership by the U.S. drones. They've gotten a number of key leaders recently, and the last one was Belidi, who was in Abyan, and they had just taken over sections of Abyan, and he was killed by a drone strike. So the Saudis have declined to attack them. The Saudis, in response to the question about what about Al-Qaeda, because they say that the main threat in Yemen to them is Al-Qaeda, they have not gone against them. And they say, well, we will go against them once there's a coherent government in Sana'a, a capable government in Sana'a, and that looks like a long way off. So there's kind of an implicit alliance with Al-Qaeda in the southern forces.
And very briefly, I mean, this has turned into a proxy conflict, and maybe before we turn to Amat, you could just unpack a little bit what you see as the Saudi and Iranian roles in exacerbating the conflict.
The Iranians don't play much of a role. The amount of support that goes to the Houthi, that's one key thing. I mean, you get statements, and these are scary statements. Muqtashi said that this is a war between Arabs and Persians. And the forces in Yemen are not Persians. They're Arabs. They're Houthi. They're Saleh and whatnot. And to characterize it as a war between Arab and Persians is to sort of discount the very large set of social forces that Saleh is able to lead. Saleh's on the YouTube all the time, and he makes these speeches, and he can talk to the Yemeni people. I think he can talk to the Yemeni people better than any other actor does. I mean, clearly better than Hadi. Hadi has no. I mean, he's non-charismatic, has no vision, and doesn't speak to anybody. And Abdul Malik is kind of, just kind of one of these authoritarian leaders talking, sort of. Platitudes and whatnot, but Saleh talks to the Yemeni people, and people listen, and so he represents a large force of people that in any kind of a settlement are going to have to be represented, the Saudis, seem to characterize it as all the Iranians, and it's not. It's clearly not. Now the Saudis, of course, are pouring in tons of resources into this. It's a huge expense for them. It's a major military adventure for them. If we want to talk about intervention, theirs is by far the largest, and their payoff is not been all that great. I mean, if you look at the areas that their coalition controls, it's like disaster. And you have, for example, I think one of the things that the resistance fighters, the southern resistance fighters, one of the things they demanded immediately was that the resistance that fought to get the Houthi and Saleh out of Aden, those resistance fighters in Dalia and Lahij, Radfan, those areas, that they be integrated into the regular Yemeni military, and a lot of it has to do with support, right? They need salaries. It's a huge issue. I mean, the country economically is being absolutely destroyed. Poverty is a huge issue. Those that can pay can gather support, and they're not paying. The Muqawama, the resistance, is being sort of silent. They put a few leaders, key leaders, the governor of Aden, his security leader in Aden, also they're big symbolic leaders of the southern resistance. But you find fighting. There was fighting today in Aden, where some of the resistance people felt that they were being sort of marginalized and not being paid and not being brought in. So they're not getting they're not creating a cohesive force with the resources that they're putting in there. They're just adding to the destruction.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit further about that, but I just want to turn to Amat. Before I get into your role in the national dialogue and your view of the roots of this conflict, would you agree, I want to ask you about whether you agree with Charles's characterization of Iran's role in this conflict. He said they don't play much of a role.
I fully agree with Dr. Schmidt on that regard, and also on the other issues that he really had highlighted. But also let me start also by saying the following, that the coalition, and I want to attract your attention to what I'm going to say in this regard, that the coalition has completed the Decisive Storm campaign at the request of the Yemeni government and the president of Yemen. Al-Asiri stated, Al-Asiri is the spokesperson of the Ministry of Defense and also of the coalition, of the Saudi coalition led in the war in Yemen. The primary goals of the campaign has been achieved and sovereignty has been protected. We are able to confirm that the Houthis are no longer or a threat to Yemenis or neighboring countries. Actually, Al-Asiri announced this on April 2015. And after that, of course, he announced on the beginning and the start of the so-called Restoring Hope operation, which meant, of course, they continued as well bombardment, the airstrikes, and at a later stage, and starting after the liberation of Aden in July 2015 as well, that many ground troops have joined the fight, including from Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Sudan, and other nationalities. Some people speak about also the involvement of some mercenaries or some security groups that have been contracted by Gulf countries to also participate on the ground, especially on the wake of the rocket attacks on the Emirati and the Saudi and the Bahraini troops in Marib, also in midsummer last year. Also, Mr. Asiri announced that the campaign Restoring Hope, and for the last 10 months, as you know, this operation have intensified. Again, I would like also to attract your attention to the fact that Yemen was experiencing a humanitarian crisis way before even the Saudi-led coalition started its operation in Yemen. But let me give you some figures and numbers on the dire and the immediate impact of the current ongoing really war in Yemen. So, for example, and this is all this information is actually provided by the United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator as of last week, actually. So, the population of Yemen, which is estimated between 26 to 28 million people, those people, 82% of them are now in a form of aid or the other. especially starting from the day of March 26th, when the blockade, which has been highlighted by Dr. Schmidt, when the blockade has been in effect, and it hasn't really led, even when they allowed for the entrance of some basic, food and rations and some medical equipments, but the need for all these necessities is still in the rise and actually is leading to a big humanitarian catastrophe, and that is going to be very soon, unfortunately. This also, the humanitarian actors say that at least 33% of the 21.2 million people since the conflict began, they need really full kind of humanitarian aid, not just a form of aid. They have nothing. In addition to that, also, those considered food insecure have reached 35% of 14 million people and 4,000 people since the conflict began. Then you have also those without access to safe drinking water or sanitation, which has reached to 48% from the 19.3 million people who actually usually suffer from that need or need that badly. Also, those who have been forced to leave their homes and villages and governorates have now reached the 2.5 million people. Most of them now are concentrated in Sana'a or in the surrounding of Sana'a, because even with the excessive raids and airstrikes, there was a possibility still, because there was no internal fighting, at least until now, so people find it as a place for refuge. In addition to the fact that even when the Southerners made it to Aden after the announcement of the liberation of Aden in July 2015, those Southerners who have made it to Aden, now they are returning back to Sana'a and to the other parts of the north, because with the increasing level of insecurity and the different enfranchised, if you will, militants and armed groups, and the daily assassinations and suicide bombings, and the case of the state of chaos has led actually to a big number of Southerners also fleeing back to Sana'a. Meaning also, now Sana'a has at least doubled its population, which used to be 2 million people prior to the current, conflict. With that in mind as well, these people also are obliged to live on a daily suffering with almost 0 hour of electricity. Let alone, of course, if you want to speak about fuel and other, goods and supplies, but also led to the spread of some epidemics, including some forms of swine influenza, and in addition to that, also to dengue fever in parts in the southern part of Yemen, including Taiz governorate, Aden, and the rest of the other southern and eastern governorates as well. And these are, as you know, all diseases could be prevented by simple antibiotic and some basic, really, medicine, which are not coming or reaching the entire Yemeni population. Now also, even for the humanitarian relief, which is, of course, going through a lot of difficulties, and I'm sure you are all following on the exchange between the humanitarian coordinator of the United Nations and the coalition forces, not just in terms of the adherence to the principles and of the humanitarian international law, if you will, but also to the inability of the humanitarian actors, wherever they can really find a way where they can serve the population, that they are not even spared from being attacked and targeted, as it happened, for Médecins Sans Frontières and also for the other international Oxfam in the beginning of the war, and other even internally displaced camps for people of Saada region who have been actually dispersed during, and the remnants of those who have been dispersed during the 6 wars between the Houthis and Saleh. So with this picture, and also with what Dr. Schmidt has spoken about, especially the suffering of entire governorate, for example, like Taiz, which is the most populated also governorate of the country. It's almost 4 million people. And of course, many of them have been forced as well to leave. Many of them had to go to rural areas, but the infighting has also spread and moved with them. And now you have almost a full-scale internal fighting going on almost in the biggest part of Taiz, which has been always the most economically viable governorate, the most educated governorate, the most in everything that when you want to have, a list of checklist of the best of the country's ability to gain from development, etc. So with this situation in mind, and also with the spread of the different as well elements of militant groups from the Islamic State, Daesh, or from Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda, of course, needless to say, is actually sitting and running Hadramaut in Al-Mukalla. They are collecting taxes. They are not only slashing those who are accused of committing adultery or being described as apostates, or rather, they are actually doing the job of a state. So they are also running universities and institutions. They have been also ordering companies to pay taxes and banks as well to pay to them, since they are the ones who are running really the show in that particular governorate. And needless to say, Hadramaut is also not just the wealthiest part of the south, it is also the largest of all governorates in Yemen. It actually composes 1/6 of the entire space of Yemen in general. And in addition to that, its immediate borders go to very, very close, if not enters with the Saudi borders and also with Oman borders. For all these issues, and also for all the geographical descriptions and political also fallouts of it, they're definitely Al-Hadramaut being under the elements of Al-Qaeda is a fact, even if you hear from time to time a full denial, or at least when they underplay their presence and saying, well, next, definitely the coalition forces will go after these elements. This is going to be a totally different imaginary, scenario to me. Now, if the humanitarian situation composes the first and the most immediate challenge to the peace, because you can't have a peace if you have such a dire and volatile and truly it's fully inhumane situation where people are just struggling to stay alive. And in addition to that, of course, it has led, of course, to the whole halt almost of the economic activity. It was announced throughout the World Bank and also through the government of Yemen. That is the population, of course, of Yemen has actually now reached the level of almost 33% of all Yemenis are truly below, 65% of all Yemenis are under poverty line. And of course, before the war, again, it's important to confirm the level of poverty that Yemenis have also undergone. But this particular one-year war has led to almost full slide of the entire population, because it was not only that the government stopped working, I should say the two governments working, the one staying in Aden and the other one, the de facto in Sana'a, but it has led actually also to the collapse of the private economic activity. And almost 60% actually of all private businesses had to lay off their workers. And that happened like almost 3 months immediately after the war, because in one hand you had a blockade that wouldn't allow or facilitate the entrance of shipments of goods and other commodities to come to Yemen. Plus, of course, many companies and private companies had to stop doing that because they were only paying salaries for their workers without any further production. And it is important as well to say that the oil and the gas production, which also was based as the heart of the whole production of the economic activities in Yemen, and also which composed at least 70% of the government's budget, has come to a full stand-off. It has stopped fully. So you can imagine with that level as well of economic deprivation, the sense of why and how are you going to be able to rebuild any contraction for peace or to call for recovery or to call for any kind of getting back together and trying really to really go over it.
Well,
lastly, on Sana'a, because I'm sure also you are following as well some of the very cheered statements by different officials, either in the government or by the coalition spokesperson, that they are already at the outskirts of Sana'a, and it's just a matter of the artillery of the national resistance troops to just make it to Sana'a. And with that, of course, as you know, with all the difficulties that we have been speaking about, and it's very important to remember what has happened to Aden when it was liberated, and especially when it comes to the killing, to the destruction of the minorities, of their heritage, to the entire infrastructure, and also to the looting, and specifically, one has to pay a major attention to the whole concept of the forces which have been now infiltrated and have been able not just to loot the regular medium-sized kind of weaponry, rather those who have been able as well to reach out and to capture and to loot even heavy weaponry, and whatever is going to happen if truly the coalition insists and wants to achieve victory and to bring the president back to the Republican Palace in Sana'a by force and through also the continuation of war. But definitely Yemen is being divided now, divided not just on the south-north equation, with also a little bit of some sectarian, unfortunate, flavor. Actually, it has been almost divided, almost on the basis, even within each governorate separately. The situation is so dire and disintegrated, and people are really at the edge of fighting each other.
But I'm curious, I mean, in your position as a former minister, you know how important Yemen is to Saudi Arabia. It's very much in its sphere of influence. Saudi Arabia perceives Yemen as having a sort of a pro-Iranian force on the border with Yemen. What would you have Saudi Arabia do otherwise, given what they perceive as a pro-Iranian force on their border?
Well, of course, the Saudis were very clear from day one that they are fighting the Iranian elements and the Iranian expansion and the Safawi, the Persian influence as well in Yemen. Not only that, but even the Mufti of Saudi Arabia and some religious figures have actually come out with lots of fatwas, that's religious order, saying that we are fighting actually the Persian expansion and the Safawi extension in Yemen. And I mean, those who really know Yemen and who know as well, and those who know Saudi Arabia as well, they know exactly the level of really danger that is posed by the Houthis. It is also unfortunate that the Houthis also did not help in so many regards, and especially when they were capable and able of controlling the capital and some other governorates as well. And even before that, it seemed like they were so victoriously feeling that they wanted as well to exercise some military maneuvers close to the border of Saudi Arabia, which led really to a full scare of the kingdom, not only the kingdom, but also the entire Gulf countries. That was not helpful, but as also Dr. Schmitz said, and I agree with him fully, I think that support, the visioned support or the perceived support to the Houthis from Iran, it appears to be all of rhetorical kind of thing, but unfortunately the damage has been done, and the Saudis feel, they are convinced that the Houthis have started with the support and with the help of Hezbollah and also other elements from the Iranian guards, the revolutionary guards, of building factories for rockets that were, they thought, capable of reaching different, territories of Saudi Arabia. But of course, one has also to read this particular relationship in view of its historical evidences and also of its sensitivities in relation even to the role played by Saudi Arabia itself in the early 60s, when that part of Yemen was actually backed by the kingdom then. But as you know, geopolitics change sometimes even by monthly measurement, not just by yearly one.
Thank you. I want to just wrap up the conversation about the humanitarian crisis before we have a round of questions about political solutions. Mr. Plitt, could you characterize from your seat at USAID the scope of the humanitarian crisis, and what is the U.S. and what are the international community doing to resolve some of this terrible suffering that Amat has spelled out?
Yeah, certainly. I think this is on. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes. Just get a little closer.
Yeah, maybe
I guess we
switch that. I think as both Kate and Amat have said, the Yemen emergency has been the one kind of the critical emergency in the world that's kind of flown under the radar. I know Amat cited some statistics. I mean, it kind of comes out that 21 million people are in need of emergency assistance, and that's the largest need in any country elsewhere on the globe. So that kind of goes unstated, given all the other emergencies that the international community is trying to respond to. I guess our concern is that with the continuation of the conflict and the concern that there aren't many good signs of it abating, that it's going to make the lift, that it's already a heavy lift in terms of humanitarian assistance, it's going to make a recovery lift even that much harder as the economy collapses and the institutions that are supposed to support that economy collapse. In the midst of the crisis, I mean, before the crisis, I think Amat had said, the country was already in a pretty dire state in terms of food security. It's one of the most food insecure countries in the world. I have a couple of good graphics. It might be hard for everyone to see, but I think I've got some bright colors here. So which this kind of comes from our FuseNet facility that USAID funds that looks at food security crises throughout the world. Before the emergency in March, I guess in January, this is kind of the state of Yemen in terms of food security, with the yellow being areas that are under stress and the brownish areas being areas which were kind of in a crisis mode where humanitarian assistance was being delivered even before the conflict. Now, what it looks like now after 9-10 months of conflict is this, where now the area where the conflict is less affected out in Hadramaut, but if you look at the south and the west of the country, that has moved into an emergency state where people are in desperate need. The next stage after emergency is famine. So they're on the fringes of famine, and then most of the rest of the central populated areas of the country are in crisis mode. And the trajectory is still looking rather negative. I mean, there has been an increase in food getting into the country via smuggling, some improvements in shipping, but this is what our FuseNet projects things to look like in March if there's not improvements, where there's a slight spreading of the crisis mode and a greater reach of the crisis mode and also some expanding emergency needs. We're not yet forecasting famine yet, but there's always a data lag. So it is definitely cause for concern, the state of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. I guess the other thing I would notice is, we've always been dealing with malnourishment and severe malnourishment in Yemen. Right now, we project or estimate that there's 2 million people suffering from malnutrition. 1.3 million of those are children, and about a third of those are suffering from severe acute malnutrition. I think this kind of informs us as we start thinking about the state institutions that have to try to respond, which have kind of been blocked from responding, both in terms of who's heading them, as well as the resources they have available to respond. I think Amat already mentioned that the sources of revenues that have run the state have pretty much run dry in terms of hydrocarbon exports. Foreign reserves have been drawn down dramatically throughout the crisis for the government to be able to pay salaries when it was able to. The Social Welfare Fund, which was kind of the social safety net run by the state to try to address the, with cash transfers to the most needy of the country, hasn't dispersed anything since the beginning of 2015. So they've gone over a year without being able to deliver to their most needy, from the point of view of the state. I think the one, I guess, looking for a little pieces of hope, the technocrats who are running the schools are trying to, are able to open the schools in a lot of the areas less affected by the conflict. I think we have an estimate that there might be 60 to 70% of children in Yemen going to school where the conflict is not too severe. So, I mean, we have to acknowledge and I guess applaud the efforts that are being made to try to maintain some sense of normalcy. And I guess the concern with the fact of the state of collapse that we're looking at with the economy, it's going to make the response and the recovery period that much more dire. Where are we going to start from? I mean, we have already initiated discussions with the donors on how we're going to approach recovery to make sure we can jump off to the right foot in the golden hour, prioritize the right things, coordinate appropriately. The security question becomes the biggest issue, and also what is going to be the umbrella on the political process that will enable a recovery to get going.
So how much is the U.S. spending right now on the humanitarian crisis?
On the humanitarian front, last year we spent $178 million. So we're one of the largest donors to the response. This response is being led by the UN, and I guess one of the things that kind of what some of the things Charles was saying in terms of the biggest challenge of the response in Yemen, I think, is the fact that the conflicting parties. It's a different kind of response because it's so dispersed. Who is in charge? Even if the parties at a high level through UN talks can achieve a ceasefire, can that ceasefire be informed on the ground? Be enforced on the ground? I think that's been the challenge for humanitarian actors. Even if there is agreement on a ceasefire, and there have been ceasefires named and announced, but in the end, it comes down to the NGO actors and the international actors who are trying to deliberate to kind of negotiate access locally. And that's been the most reliable way of ensuring that there is access.
Thank you. Les, I know you've been called in to talk about Yemen with the NSC, and the U.S. is playing many roles, providing humanitarian aid, but also supporting the Saudi-led coalition. Some would say that that's somewhat contradictory, but maybe you could talk about what you think the U.S. wants to see achieved in Yemen.
Sure, I'll try to do that, but I'll do something else first. And actually, before I forget, I'll just mention for anyone who hasn't already seen it, the International Crisis Group released a report 2 days ago on Yemen, really complete and incredibly detailed. And for those of you who want to, spend an hour or two catching up and getting all the nuance, it's really a fantastic report. So ICG, I think February 9th or February 10th. Just before I address the U.S. role, which I'll have to guess at a little bit, but address it, I just want to do something that people seldom do with Yemen, which is try to simplify it before I, again, make it complicated. It's very complicated, but I'll see if I can simplify something. And I want to do this to make a point, which is that many of the fault lines that existed prior to this conflict, many of the the competition for power, the traditional demands that have been made in various regions, what the tribes want, and so on. Much, if most of that, remains the same. There's this overlay of the Saudis invading, and an overlay of Iran causing mischief, and an overlay of more hostilities than Yemen has seen in a couple of decades. And I'm not downplaying all this. I think it's all important. But it's sort of masking, I think, the fact that the conflicts and the demands and the pressures that are driving this remain roughly the same as they have been. And I'll see if I can simplify that a little bit. There are a lot of, I see in the audience, many people who know a lot about Yemen, so I hope I don't do any real damage to the situation by trying to do this, but I'll do my best. And the reason I want to make this point is that I'll then kind of launch into a point about how we might move forward and how the U.S. might move forward if people accept my analysis. So, the Houthis, and I think Dr. Schmitz was going in this direction. I really agree with him when he says this thing. He said, you said Northerners or something like that, and I think that that's almost a better way of putting it, because there has been for a decade or two, maybe longer, a movement in the north of Yemen, Sada is the main governorate, to have more control over their own destiny. A group of people living there looking for some kind of autonomous region, but they did not, and I don't think they want now, full separation. They're not full secession from Yemen. They're also very interested in power sharing and resource sharing. And there's never, at least in my experience in Yemen, which goes back about 21 years now, there has never been a time where the Yemenis have come to an accommodation on the demands of the people in the north. There have been some attempts, but there have been many skirmishes and wars that really revolve around the demands of the Houthis and others in the north for what a lot of people in Yemen feel is too much. That they don't, if they have their own territory to govern, they shouldn't also be asking for power sharing in the center and shouldn't also be asking for a share of resources. And this is a very thorny, very long-standing, very deeply rooted negotiation that's been going on for a long time. And as many people here know, sometimes Saleh is against the people in the north. Mostly, actually, he's only been for them recently when it seemed to serve his purposes. So he fought many wars, as did his former ally, Ali Musin, who's now his enemy. And then, I'll go to the south and skip the center for a second. And by the way, the people north, many are Zaidi, and this is where you get this sort of sectarian idea, but not all. And I don't think that that's the fundamental issue of the north. It's not fundamentally a sectarian issue, although there is an element to that, because the Houthi and the Houthi leaders like to draw on their religious legitimacy from their point of view. So they kind of stoke that a little bit. Other people stoke it. So it is stoked, but I don't think it's the fundamental issue. In the south, you have southern secessionists. You have a large group of people who would like to carve off big pieces of the south and run them completely independently. As is usual with secessionist movements, and one of the reasons that they're so contentious all around the world is that it's amazing how many times secessionists are also sitting geographically on all the riches. If you look at the secessionist movements around the world that really cause serious issues and have caused serious conflicts, it almost is always the case that the secessionists are sitting on the oil or the hydroelectric dams or the best agricultural land or whatever, and they want to take it all with them and take it away from the country. And that's roughly the case in Yemen. They happen to be sitting on some of the most productive oil areas, some of the, a port, very good port, and so on. And so, not too surprisingly, the people in the rest of Yemen aren't all that keen to just sort of let go. And so they don't agree to say, okay, you guys can have all the prime property, and we'll just take the mountains. That's not really a good bargain. So that's been going on for a long time. Now, this is really simplifying it, because there are many, many differences within the South, and there are a lot of Southerners who favor unity. Some favor a strong central government, but a lot of Southerners favor, I guess what we would call in our terms, a loose federation. They want Southern Yemen to be part of Yemen, but in some kind of way where they can control their resources more effectively and control their lives more effectively. And then, again, very roughly speaking, you have a big group in the center. It happens to be, as Amat mentioned, because it includes ties with it, which is sort of geographically south, but part of the center. It includes a group that I'm going to characterize broadly here as technocrats, a lot of secular people in the south too, but by secular, I don't mean non-religious. I mean people for whom their primary identity is not religious. They're Yemenis who are in business and doing other things. A group that I will call nationalists. I don't think they call themselves that, but Yemenis that have what they would perceive as a national vision, have a very strong Yemeni identity, and want to sort of have that identity shared throughout the whole country. And within this group in the center, You have also a very strong presence of Islah, both Islah as a political party as well as an Islamist movement, and then there are many branches of this, including Salafis, and you have a strong representation, but also of Zaidi tribes, including former President Saleh's group and tribe, who are also Zaidis. So it's a big mixed bag. But what kind of unites them in a way is that they are against the North, having all the control they want, and they're against the South seceding. And they control, by and large, this sort of central group has long controlled the finances and the central government, and to some extent the armed forces. And the writ of the Yemen government doesn't extend very far into the periphery. So that it's often resented because they don't give benefits to the periphery. And then you have various tribes, and the tribes, some are very much associated with the kind of central nationalist types. And they're not secessionists, they're not against the national government per se, but they shift alliances. And then you have tribes that are associated with the Houthis, tribes that are in the south, and so on. I mention all this to say that, again, for as long as I've been looking at Yemen, just over 20 years, these kind of groups have all sorts of tensions have played out. One of the central tensions within the central group, the group that wants to have, by and large, a unitary Yemen, and wants to move forward and try to keep the South and the North in check. Within that group, you have the Al-Akmar family in Islah kind of versus Saleh and his son. So there's been a very long struggle for preeminence within that central group. Sometimes a very violent struggle. It plays out in very different ways, but it's been just a struggle for power. It's not particularly an ideological struggle, because sometimes they work together. But they don't like it when one group gets more power than the other. So they fight it out, and that's still a big issue right now. And then within the South, you have Al-Qaeda, or some variation of an Al-Qaeda-like group, has been very active in the South for a long time. Because think of the bombing of the USS Cole, and Aden has been a hotbed of Islamic radicalism. Strangely enough, since it's considered to be a secular place, but it's been a hotbed of this radicalism for a long time. So that's existed for a long time in Yemen. So I just mention all this to say that these kind of three very, very powerful kind of driving kind of loci of conflict and fighting have existed for a couple of decades and still exist. So the future of the North, primarily Houthi, but not exclusively Houthi, and how that plays out, the competition for power over the central government, the armed forces, the business, the triggers of business that exists between, roughly speaking, people associated with Saleh and people associated with Islah and the Al-Akmar, broad, extended Al-Akmar clan. And then the secessionist forces, or at least people who want a better bargain for the South. What does this have to do with the conflict right now? Well, in my opinion, this is where we'll get into U.S. policy and other policy, is that none of this, or very little of this, gets addressed right now. Very little of it gets addressed. The National Dialogue Conference addressed some of it, but in the end, the Dialogue Conference addressed very well a whole variety of other probably slightly easier issues to deal with, and it kind of punted on the big ones. It didn't really address the issue of federalism. They suggested a 6-region federation, but in the end, that was basically the agenda of the people in the center. It was not the agenda of either the Houthis or the Southerners. And that, in my opinion, that's kind of the proximate cause of this whole problem, is that the people who had a very strong stake in how the country was going to be structured felt that they had, kind of, pardon the language, been screwed. And they felt that this was about to be imposed by the international community. I personally think that's where this all started. And you also had then a very, very venal troublemaker called Saleh sitting in his house in Sana'a, kind of recognizing that there was this fatal flaw in the national dialogue, that they had just kind of opened the cracks of these longstanding conflicts. And so he took advantage of this. He had a lot of power and money and loyalty, and kind of cracked it all apart. And now we have this conflict. So U.S. policy, the coalition, and so on. I don't think that the Humpty Dumpty gets put back together again the way things are going. I think, as Amat said, bombing kind of indiscriminately, not entirely indiscriminately, but not very well targeted, terrible communications on the part of the Saudi led coalition, because they're just, maybe they're not trying to be terrible, but they're not really adept at managing the communications, managing this whole process. The U.S. playing a very secondary role, and I think I'm being generous by saying secondary. It's probably third area or fourth area, whatever the word might be, and kind of hands off, and assuming that a UN-led process is somehow going to impose a solution when it's not going to happen. The UN's only as good as the people backing it. The UN itself, in this case, a nice and capable but almost completely helpless special representative, will shake, and kind of a toothless backing of this poor guy is not going to solve anything. And so in the end, I think what the protagonists are, two things just to end this. First of all, I think that the dialogue and the negotiations have to be broadened. Not necessarily for a ceasefire, because I think for a ceasefire, the combatants need to be together and they have to somehow agree. Although I think that has to be imposed, and I think the U.S. has to be much more involved to impose that. But for there to be a hope of a solution, there has to be some glimmer that these fundamental fault lines and conflicts are being thought about and dealt with, and that as soon as there's a ceasefire, that these bigger issues are going to be on the table. If people don't think they're going to be on the table, they'll keep fighting, because no one's been defeated. So no reason to stop fighting, because they still think that their issues are not being addressed. So in my opinion, what the U.S. should be doing, and should be trying to strongly encourage Saudi Arabia to do, is to start broadening this discussion to say, we understand that these are fundamental issues to you, and to try to take sides a little bit less, because the Houthis may be behaving badly and they've done terrible things, but they're not going anywhere. They exist in Yemen. They will always exist in Yemen. So you've got to kind of take that into consideration. You also have to take into consideration this big group in the center, the business people, the technocrats, the kind of nationalist types. Saleh has a lot of influence with them. They're not going anywhere. They have important things to say, and they have to be drawn into this. And finally, the Southern secessionists, the secession demands may have dropped off because of the conflict, but they still exist, and they're waiting for signals that will be addressed. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Les. We only have about 25 minutes left, and we want to get to audience questions, but we also want to go through the panel one more time regarding solutions. So let me turn to you, Amat, to comment on Les and to talk about what you think the steps necessary are toward a political solution here.
Well, I agree fully, first of all. May I take my... Okay. First of all, I think, true, as Les said, you can't only rely on the parties to war to decide on the peace and the course of peace. You really have to expand very vastly the participation of those who will really make any peace agreement hold a little bit. Because true, it's not in the hands of the two major parties or four major parties to war, etc. It's about those who are involved in the grounds, which have been actually disintegrated by the fact that now, if you look at Yemen, it's almost like every governorate is going within or happening within it a special civil war in it. It's very important to look at that. Secondly, I think we cannot also underestimate the role played by the Salafi groups. Because to me, while the Islah Party, of course, have been, excuse me, party to the whole war and announced clearly and openly their backup for the Saudi coalition, actually it is the Salafi forces which have expanded, which have taken it within their own hands for ideological and religious as well purposes. And we have to see how are we going to handle that, from Al-Bayda to Marib to Aden itself to the different parts of the south to Taiz, because it's not just those political Islam members to the conflict who are actually the most effective in the war. Actually, it's the other elements and how to deal with them, and especially with the very, very strong support that they are getting from the Saudis. So we have to bear in mind how to deal with that particular issue. Plus, the South also, and I fully agree with Les, that the question of the southern separation or secession. It has, of course, underplayed, unfortunately, even the participants to the national dialogue from the South. They were not really selected based on their actual presence or their actual representation. Actually, those who have become members to the national dialogue were really handpicked by the president, and there where you go, because it was also changing all the time, that every time there is a different leadership of the South, to the extent where it was clear with the changing of 3 different leadership for the Southern group inside the dialogue, it made one think, who is representing really the South? So that was a basic question, and no matter what you do, you have to accept and understand this very serious issue and has to be dealt with within the whole bigger solution really for Yemen. Plus, now, almost as we said, the federalism prototype, which has been produced in 1.5 days after the national dialogue, as you know, it was actually done, at least it was oversimplified. And I think, excuse me, and I think without really addressing the various political groups and their as well right in really managing their own affairs, especially when it comes to the benefiting from the national development. Most of the cases and the revolutions in different parts of Yemen and the regions, including Sada, including the South, it was because of the failure of the central government in Sana'a, unfortunately, to doing anything in the development arena and the national development spread and distribution of development results as well. It's also very important to talk about the necessity of a new power sharing agreement, because if everybody keeps talking about the outcome of the national dialogue as if it's really a holy and sacred book that you can't speak about it, and we see the entire country has been disintegrated and divided, and none of the issues were discussed inside the national dialogue had reached any agreement. So we might as well really think and say, what can we do at the international community level, at the level as well of the regional powers and countries, to really help Yemenis to go beyond this period where everybody's stuck just to the national dialogue, where it becomes like a holy book, nobody can touch it. So I think it's very, very important to really talk about the real strives and the real national interest of Yemen, and also the regional interest in any form. And it's possible as well, because Yemenis are very practical, as you know. Mostly they are pragmatists. They just want to live with dignity like any human being can live. And the question of economic opportunities is the basic thing in this whole conflict. So it's very important really to go about that. And I think it is, again, very important really for the international community to really look at the Yemeni case more deeply, and not to play or to just play blindly to it. And because it was clear from the beginning of this conflict, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like Yemen is being seen even within the international standard of looking at countries in conflict, especially when it comes to the compliance of the international rules. And it's very, very important to remind everybody how the international community failed to protect Yemeni civilians, and not only that, how it did its best as well to prevent any formation of any international commission to investigate whatever is said about when it comes to war crimes, to also to the violations of the international and humanitarian law. And that did not happen at any other conflict, whether you look at it in the south, in the east of the world, at any part of the world. Plus also the role of the United Nations Security Council. I am here speaking about the role of the major P5. Truly, it's very surprising, if not shocking, to see that there hasn't been not a single meeting or a call for the Security Council whereby, like what you do usually when there is a conflict, to call for a ceasefire and to try and do your best to really convince and to compile also parties to that conflict to stop this war. This is very unique. It has never happened in any conflict in any part of the world. And I think this is very telling about also the responsibility, the collective responsibility of the international community to a whole experience and a country that has been actually under the supervision of the P5, whether we like it or not, throughout the transitional process.
Great. I want to bring Charles into this
Well, I would just,
conversation. What does a de-escalation process look like to you? And
Well, let me just add a little bit, a couple of points. In terms of the Security Council 2216, well, it's not helpful. It's basically backing the Saudis. It's a formula for complete surrender on the Houthi and the Saleh, which they're not going to do. It's not a formula for ending the conflict. And the real, I haven't heard it said yet, but the real issue is that the United States is basically letting the Saudis do what they want. I read somewhere where somebody was saying in Washington people are critical, quietly critical of the Saudis. I haven't seen that anywhere. There's no criticism of the Saudis. It's backing. It's selling them $1.2 billion to re-up. It's not talking about the use of cluster bombs. It's not talking about the bombing of the medical facilities and whatnot. This is in the context of the United States trying to assure the Saudis that the U.S. is still a Saudi ally in light of the Iran agreement. I mean, and that's a key thing right there. And it speaks to why the United States is not either critical of the Saudis and what they're doing, and is sort of unable to engage Yemen in any other way, but then backing the Saudi intervention.
is there a face-saving way out of this conflict for the Saudis?
Well, yeah, that's actually an interesting question. I mean, they're now under economic pressure, and this thing's costing a lot. The prestige, of course, of the son is riding on this. He's head of the armed forces. He's also overseeing the economic restructuring that they're planning to do inside the kingdom. If somehow, and this is the difficulty, if somehow the Houthi and Saleh were able to say something, give something to them that would be safe. I mean, it's interesting. For example, the 2216 says that the Houthi are to turn over their weapons to the Yemeni military, but there is no Yemeni military, and Saleh owns most of it. So they could do that. Okay, we'll give you the militias to Saleh, right? And then we'll start. And if the Saudis could say, oh, okay, that if they could do something like that, it's just going to take steps on both sides. But I don't see. There's no sign of that at all yet.
I apologize to Les and Andy for not bringing them more into this conversation, but I'm hoping, because we are running late, and I want to turn to the audience, that the audience will ask questions about the humanitarian crisis and also about steps forward. So I think I'm going to bundle questions. Let me start with this gentleman first, and then we'll take this gentleman second. I'll do 3 questions at a time. So this gentleman here, if you could please introduce yourself.
Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and former diplomat. If you took a Zaidi or even an Alawi and placed them into a conservative Shia community, it'd be viewed as heathen slime. So what can we do?
As what?
Heathen slime. I mean, these are not the same things. What can we do to get our news media to stop calling Houthis Shia? Because it obscures the nature of this proxy war.
Okay, next question here.
Yes, I'm Russell King. I saw a film called Losing Our Sons about the Little Rock shooting at the recruiting station, military recruiting station. And the gunman there, apparently, according to the movie, was trained in Yemen. So that would be a legitimate target. But one major presidential candidate says he wants to let the Russians bomb anybody they want in Syria. And it basically is for indiscriminate type killing, much like King Herod, going after one little boy and killing all the little boys. Putin has a definition of a Daesh which is expanded, much bigger than ours, and this candidate wants to let Putin take care of it. But what is the best way within Yemen to deal with a particular situation? We have a legitimate target. What law enforcement and military actions would you recommend to the President of the United States?
Okay, so how to attack Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And a third question, there was Amal, you had your hand up?
My question is about something Mr. Schmitz said, that the Yemenis still listen to Saleh. My question is for you, please, and for Mr. Campbell. Do you believe that Saleh still has a future in Yemen after what he did? Do you think he's still credible? Do you think he should be part of the political solution after what happened and after the GCC initiative and after what happened that they get him out? The second question is about Iran's role. That you kind of dismiss Iran's role in Yemen, but I'm from Lebanon and I see what Hezbollah is saying and doing about Yemen, and I see that some of the Houthis who died in Yemen, they buried in Beirut next to Merniye. So could you please tell us more if you know anything about, and also the shipments of the intercepted shipments of arms? Thank you.
Okay, so let's, who wants to talk about Saleh's role? Does he,
Liz knows
do you have something to add quickly? All right. This is Barbara Slavin.
Thanks, Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Whatever happened to the idea that the number 2 to Hadi could actually take over and would be a compromise candidate? Professor Schmitz, I think you've said that he was somewhat more acceptable to the Houthis. Thanks.
Okay, so does Saleh have a future? Les, why don't you, and then
Sure,
we'll get
I'll
into...
jump in. Well, I agree that he's an incredibly skilled politician. He's a survivor. Many of you will remember that he was almost killed in a bomb attack in 2011, I think it was. And he's not a young man, but he came back. He's he's sort of superhuman in some ways, amazing at coming back, and extremely smart and extremely plugged in. Unfortunately, well, I don't know. Unfortunately, he's also guilty of many terrible things, not the least of which, and maybe the most important one, is looting the country for his own benefit. So he has millions of dollars stashed away, and he uses it for very nefarious purposes. I think that this is a bigger question, but one day we'll be looking at the lessons of what went wrong in places like Libya and Yemen, particularly in a Yemen where it seemed promising for a while. And one of the things that went wrong is that we really have not found a way to sort of deal with impunity. And so letting Saleh sit in Sana'a without really any recrimination, I know there were threats of taking away his assets, but nothing happened, was really a terrible mistake. He was never going to accept the outcome of a dialogue that didn't kind of continue to enrich him and give him power. So you can't keep him there. But having said that, there are many people. There's lots of blame to go around, and one of the scenarios that is out there, and I kind of agree with this, is that if Saleh is to leave, and I think he probably has to leave for there to be peace, then perhaps Hadi has to leave as well. Not necessarily, Hadi has more legitimacy at the moment, but he's not really a part of the solution in the future. And there are others. Some people mention the military commander Ali Musin as well. I don't have a really strong opinion on who might have to leave, but I think it's quite clear that there are some tremendous irritants. There are people that are responsible for the killings of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. There are people who have looted the country, and I think it's a little bit hard to go back now and make them the key parts of your peace agreement. I don't think that works. I think that's just a recipe for future conflict. And I think, Barbara, you're mentioning Khaled Baha, who is the prime minister. He's kind of, in a way, they're a representative of this group that I was mentioning, the technocratic, business-type, highly educated, very able guy. He has his own issues, but I think that he's not the only one. Yemen is not, I'll say, because this is such a downer panel in some ways, I'm really sad about that. I'll repeat something, though, that many of you know, but I think it bears saying. Yemen is not a basket case country at all. And it's not one of these places where, you can't find a single good leader. There are tons of able people in Yemen. Some of them are now abroad, but they're fantastic, educated, smart, ambitious people. One of them is at this table who has had government positions in the past. And there are lots of them. And so Baha is a good guy. I think he's great. But he's not the only answer. We don't have to kind of pin it on one person. And that was maybe one of the problems with Hadi. Hadi had some strengths, but he's not the savior. So my argument would be, let's bring a lot more people to the table and try to get them empowered. And there will be leaders that emerge out of that. I'm not too worried about leaders in Yemen.
Amat, what about Amal's concern that, perhaps you and Charles are minimizing Iran's influence in Yemen, and that Iran really does have sort of deeper and more problematic interest there?
I think Dr. Schmitz
Well,
will answer.
I think the comparison to Hezbollah, it's okay. It's a good one. So if we compare it to Hezbollah, the support for Iran is far less, and the command and control of Iran is far less. This was really something that the Houthi gave to Iran. It was, a political benefit really on the cheap. And it's to say that one of the Iranian strategies, of course, has been to play on social problems within the Arab countries, and to play up particularly the narrative of the oppressed Shia. The Shia have been oppressed, and that way get themselves into local conflicts. The conflict in Yemen was there, and the Houthis' power was there already. It wasn't like this. The Houthi needed Iran to get powerful. Their power is their own base. That's why the Iranians, for the Iranians, it was cheap. There was support. We're not saying there was no support. Yes, I'm sure money, some weapons. Yemenis have been trained, as you said. The Yemeni were going to Manar. They are going up to get media training, and to get some fighting trainings like that. They haven't yet produced any Iranians inside of Yemen, but I'm sure there was some military advice and this kind of stuff. But its role in the Yemeni conflict is very small. In other words, in terms of the outcome of the conflict. So that's why we minimize it.
Can I address this targeting? I know the targeting question because it was very different than our responses. Yeah. I'll mention, the Yemen government under Saleh and then under Hadi, and probably under Baha if he ends up taking this, has always cooperated with U.S. counterterrorism efforts and others. And they've been extremely cooperative, and I would imagine they would continue to be cooperative. And the tribes in the areas that tend to house Al-Qaeda are almost without exception against Al-Qaeda. They don't have the power and the money to fight them all the time, but they really don't want them there. So Yemen, the problem is it's very rugged, mountainous, remote. The government is not able to extend its power into its hinterlands. That's the fundamental reason you have terrorist groups there. It's not because, in my opinion, it's not because Yemenis are inclined to host this. But it's a long-term problem. The long-term solution is a competent government that can extend its reach into the hinterlands with services and so on. But that's probably many years off. But in the meantime, there's never been a problem with cooperation.
So there was a question about sectarianism. I'm not sure I fully understood it. Did anybody want to address it, or shall we just take two final questions? And then I've got a question for Andrew. So let's get this gentleman with the tie here. If you could. And there's another woman in red in the back. The woman in red. And we have a gentleman. Oh, I'll take three questions. And the gentleman here with his hand up. Yes.
Thank you. I was wondering if the panelists could comment on the situation of refugees and IDPs in the region and how that might complicate a solution going forward.
Great question for Andy. And there was a woman with your hand up, please. Yep. Could you please speak into the mic? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Colleen McCusker, and I was very impressed to hear that there was some recognition of the United States' reluctance to take a stand on this issue, and maybe that is tied somewhat with our alliance with Saudi Arabia, and maybe what it's going to take for us to move past that, or is it even possible?
Oh, okay, and then a mic to this gentleman with his hand up. Yeah, okay.
Hello, I'm Mohammed Al-Wazir from Arabian Rights Watch Association. I'm a Yemeni American. I just have a concern with U.S. counterterrorism policy in Yemen. Not so much the policy, as I'm in total agreement with it, but the strategy that implements it. There are many groups in Yemen that are totally against AQAP and ISIS. I don't see any support going towards those people who are actually against it. There are drone strikes happening, but nothing necessarily on the ground. I think more support can be given to groups that are actually fighting AQAP and ISIS on the ground. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. Let's start with the refugee question. I'm sorry? Oh, is it very quick? All right. I will be very generous. Please speak into the mic.
Yeah, I own a coffee company focused on coffee from Yemen. So I really wanted to have a question about.
Change at least, yes.
Something positive.
So I really want to have a sense from the panelists, what is the role of business in finding a solution to these issues? So, for example, there are 650,000 people in Yemen that derive income from coffee. So clearly there's an opportunity there that we grow the market here in the U.S. with.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll wrap up. Let's start with Andy talking about the refugees and what sort of plans are in place to address what is clearly going to be a long-term unfolding crisis.
No, I mean, I think as Amat, mentioned the stats on the IDPs and how the flooding in and around Sana'a and how it's a struggle to deal with it. I mean, in the best of refugee crises, or in this case, displaced crises, there's not enough resources and housing to go around, and so there's a reliance on host communities and makeshift housing, and I think that's going to remain to be a problem until there is a cessation. And then, of course, with the level of destruction that's taken place this time, largely due to airstrikes, it's going to remain an ongoing problem. Not to mention the fact that will there be economic livelihoods for them to be able to support themselves? And whenever there are crises like this and migrations like this, of course, people have to seek to go to places either where they have relatives that they can rely on and those kind of coping mechanisms, or where they think there's going to be economic opportunity so that they can take care of themselves, because there's always going to be gaps in needs. And I think one of the, I think I alluded to earlier, one of the big challenges just for the UN response is the pressures that they're under from the conflict. In these humanitarian crises, the UN operates under a cluster system, and they have, because of the threats and the violence that's going on, and that has impacted their operations, they've had to shift their clusters from various places, whether it was from starting off in Sana'a, then going back to Oman, and in some cases some of the clusters have logistical clusters based in Djibouti, where they've been transshipping a lot of their humanitarian supplies. So even like as I said before the conflict, it was a significant challenge for a humanitarian response, and it has just gotten that much more complex with all the access issues in the current crisis.
Okay, no, Amat wanted to respond. We're pressed for time, just keep that in mind.
Well, when I was at the Ministry of Human Rights in 2003, we had officially in our books at least 650,000 refugees from the Horn of Africa. That was in 2003. Believe it or not, during the current war as well, and according to the Office of the Commissioner of Refugees of the UN, there was 92,000 refugees coming into Yemen during last year alone. That continues. But also the opposite refugee movement, there has been Yemenis who have been really so desperate that they tried as well to make it to Somalia. They could not, except for a very small number of those who had some families there. Also, we had between 2,000 to 5,000 refugees officially in Djibouti. And I'm sure you understand that now. Of course, you are helping them as well through that. But for the vast majority of Yemenis, they could not really flee the places where they are because they can't leave the country, simply. They can't go to any Gulf country. As you know, the visa was not even possible during even a time of peace and a time of friendly, brotherly relations. But after the war, Yemenis had no chance to go anywhere if they really wanted to flee. And this is a major also challenge, because I think if it was really for Yemenis, you would have now almost closer to the Syrian wave of refuge, but because they can't go anywhere. And this is very important to speak about, because people are not allowed to flee for their lives.
They're trapped. Charles, do you want to address any of the remaining three questions, counterterrorism, business, or the U.S. role? Choice.
Well, let me emphasize that the country just prior to the war was in a state of economic freefall, and this has exacerbated. So the question about business and rebuilding the country is huge. In a period, in probably the country's most critical period to address economic issues, when it really needed to be united and focus its capabilities on finding solutions to its economic problems. Instead, it went to war. And it has exacerbated the economic situation such that it's really dire now. And the needs, basic infrastructure has been destroyed. And so just getting roads and communications and these things back up again and government buildings functioning again is a huge cost, probably equal to the country's GDP in a year, right? So, I mean, yeah, the estimate is it's $100 billion, and the GDP of the country is, if we put it 30 or 35 billion dollars, that's 3 times the country's annual GDP. That's a tremendous amount of money that's needed, and that's just to get the business going again, right? That's just to get things rolling again. And much of the business, the largest firms have all left. You're left with just very small stuff going on. And the level of commerce and the level of goods is I mean, people are desperate right now. So that is actually a huge and a massive issue that we're not even getting to address.
Les, do you want to address that the question from the gentleman about support for the fight against AQAP?
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree. I work for an organization called NDR, the National Democratic Institute, and we've for many years worked with tribes in some of the most troubled tribal areas, and I've met with dozens of tribal sheikhs, and all of them have said, and I think 90% of them mean it, but maybe more, that they would like to have help in fighting AQAP. That they've said, we don't want these people, but what choice do we have? We don't have money, we don't have weapons, we don't have anything that we can use to fight them, and the exact areas where AQAP thrives are exactly where the government provides the least resources. So these tribes are completely cut off. They have, there's literally no extension of the state at all. So they're on their own. And being on their own, they have to survive. And so I think as a strategy, you're exactly right that there would be a very welcome ear. But the U.S., not just the U.S., I think to be fair, other countries, that there was often G20 meetings in Yemen of various Western ambassadors would meet. These are areas that they could never travel to. These were areas that were so insecure you couldn't really do development work. USAID and others could do very little in those places. The U.S. military did some, but I mean it's not very easy. I mean, to be a little bit fair, it's not obvious how you would do it, but I think it's an important idea. Just maybe to finish, I'll address the Saudi Arabia comment, which is, I think it is kind of mystifying. I mean, it's, we appear to, these days anyway, kind of overreact by, it would appear on the surface, support various Saudi initiatives and endeavors as if Saudi interests are the same as our interests, and they clearly aren't, especially in places like Yemen and Iraq, where they're up to something, I think, quite different than what would be good for the United States. And one hopes that something different is said in private than in public. But I agree with Dr. Schmitz. There have been a few statements about the Yemen war. I think 2 weeks ago, the State Department issued quite a strong statement against some of the bad targeting and so on. But they haven't been very many. And one hopes that there are stronger statements in private than in public.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up this downer panel. Clearly, there's a long conversation to be had about Yemen, but in the meantime, please join me in thanking our terrific panelists.